Hi, I'm Chris Sare from the LaRouche Organization, and with me is Bob Wesser, also from the LaRouche Organization, who's done great work on history. We wanted to do a presentation today, which will be sort of an introduction, because we intend to do a series of videos more in depth on these topics, but to give an overview of the importance of the American history that has been covered up and stolen from Americans from the world. This is the World Land Bridge. Now, the point we're going to make in this presentation today is that what you see here, which LaRouche championed in his life, and you'll see where, I think, as this history is presented, you'll see where he got that from. It was not just his idea, it was an intention from the United States all along, but he really uncovered the real American outlook and the real American intention. And that American intention is being realized right now by China, primarily, working with Russia, working with India, working with other nations, hopefully working with the United States, because that was the original intention of the people who founded this nation. But what are they doing? They're building incredible infrastructure projects that will link up the nations of the world. And most importantly, as you'll see, this is a key point, that they are building rail in the interior of continents, that they are developing the interiors of continents. We're going to talk about the problem of empire. Now, the Venetian Empire, which prided itself coming directly from the Roman Empire, the outlook of the Roman Empire, and later we'll see recreated in the British Empire. But the empire system is what the United States was uniquely founded to defeat and really to save mankind from once and for all. So what the principle of empire is, number one, it's a view of mankind, which you see again and again in the philosophers of empires, so-called philosophers, like, for example, John Locke later in the British Empire. But it's a bestial view of man. It's the view of Aristotle, that some men are born to rule, other men are born to be slaves, and that's just the way it is. And so one of the ways in which the Venetian Empire and all empires, particularly the British Empire later, what they did, go to the next slide. You'll see this is the Mongol Empire, but this was fostered by the Venetians in a big way, as well as the Ottoman Empire. Now you'll notice something about where these empires are, right? The Ottoman Empire and the Mongol Empire, this is the crossroads of civilization right here, the Ottoman Empire. If you block economic development in that internal area of Eurasia, then you control the trade of the seas. And that's what the Venetians did. And later on, that's what the British did. That's what the British insisted on. So how do we break that? How do we break that control? Well, you've got to create a principle of a nation state and the right of the people in that nation state to have economic development, to have all the blessings of liberty that the United States later on became. But go to the next slide. This person, Nicholas of Cusa, LaRouche and Helga LaRouche particularly, identified as a mind in the Renaissance of Europe, who, go to the next slide. When you read this quote from him, this is from his Concordancia Catholica. And just listen to this. This is in 1434. He writes this in Germany. There was no real Germany then, but in the Habsburg, I don't know, in that area, whatever oligarchs were running the show there. But he says, hence, since natural law is based on reason, all law is rooted by nature in the reason of man. For since all are by nature free, every governance, whether it consists in a written law or in living law in the person of a prince, can only come from the agreement and consent of the subjects. For if men are by nature equal in power and equally free, the true, properly ordered authority of one common ruler, who is their equal in power, can only be constituted by the election and consent of the others. And law is also established by consent of the governed. Now, where do we hear that phrase later on? Well, that document right next to it, Declaration of Independence. So this is an idea which is way ahead of its time. Now, the question is, where is this idea going to take root? It's not going to take root in Europe in 1434. There's absolutely no way. So there was a project launched. That project, you see, his friend was a map maker, Toscanelli. And Toscanelli made a map that was the map that guided Columbus west. And Columbus and the whole project, the whole Cusa project, was to get out of Europe and go west. And they came to the Americas. And the idea was you had to get out of the oligarchical stranglehold in order to create a republic based on these ideas, these principles that Cusa was talking about. So Bob, if you want to pick it up from there, we can move a century forward.
Yeah, so in the 17th century, this whole project was picked up in a very, very big way by that gentleman you see on the left, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And Leibniz was part of somewhat of a renaissance in Europe at the time that came out of the Treaty of Westphalia. After decades and decades of horrific, brutal religious war, certain wiser heads prevailed to say, we can't do this anymore. We have to figure out a system of nations working together for the benefit of each other, right? The gentleman there on the right is Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And Colbert was a center of this in a very, very big way. But Colbert was a scientist. And in 1666, he established the French Academy of Sciences. Leibniz was part of that. The great scientist from the Netherlands, Huygens, was part of that. And what Leibniz was attempting to do is find anywhere on the planet he could where the seeds of these ideas that Cusa represented could actually be planted and take root. You can go to the next slide. And this is, I just want to, it's a little lengthy, but it's worth reading it to get a conception. This is a letter that Leibniz writes to Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, Peter the Great, in 1712. And here's what he says. He says, although I have very frequently been employed in public affairs and also in the judiciary system, and am consulted on such matters by great princes on an ongoing basis, I nevertheless regard the arts and sciences as a higher calling, since through them the glory of God and the best interests of the whole human race are continuously promoted. For in the sciences and the knowledge of nature and art, the wonders of God, his power, wisdom, and goodness are especially manifest. And the arts and sciences are also the true treasury of the human race. through which art masters nature and civilized peoples are distinguished from barbarian ones. For these reasons, I have loved and pursued science since my youth. The one thing I have been lacking is a leading prince who adequately embraced this cause. I'm not a man devoted solely to his native country or to any one particular nation. On the contrary, I pursue the interests of the whole human race because I regard heaven as my fatherland and all well-meaning people as its fellow citizens. To this aim, for a long time, I have been conducting a voluminous correspondence in Europe and even as far as China. And for many years, I have not only been a fellow of the French and English Royal Societies, those are the societies, scientific societies, but also direct as president of the Royal Prussian Society of Sciences. So as you can see, Leibniz on the left there is Tsar Peter the Great. Leibniz was directly, as you can see from the letter, involved with Peter the Great, who accepted the offer, and they established the Russian Academy of Sciences. Leibniz was also in dialogue with top missionaries in China who were convinced that Confucianism was compatible with Western civilization, and these things could provide a fruitful collaboration for the future of civilization. And he was involved in a fierce battle in the English-speaking world. At that point, this whole Venetian party, and we won't go through the details on it, was heck bent on taking over England and making that the new empire, the new Venice, if you will. Leibniz was trying to recruit one of the royals there, Queen Anne, and as part of this, you had the colonization of North America by English-speaking representatives of this idea to create this new form of society outside of empire. And Chris can take it from there on the next slide.
So this does take root in the United States, particularly in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the gentleman that you see up there, John Winthrop, is a very, very singular individual who organizes the entire move of hundreds of people to the United States. And he basically says in 1629, he says, the land of England has grown weary of people who should be the most precious thing in the world are now considered worthless, to be trampled on. So he says, well, but and then he invokes Genesis 1:28, be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion over the earth. So this is what LaRouche considered as the fundamental economic question: is man's dominion over nature and the reason of man, and the preciousness of man, the complete opposite of the empire view of mankind. So he organizes this move to the United States, and he says, we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill, and the eyes of the world shall be on us. So what are the two key things that they do as soon as they get things going in the Massachusetts Bay Colony? One is, you see the coins up there, the pine tree shilling. The pine tree shilling had only the backing of government. It was the intention of investment, and you see underneath the coins there, the Saugus Ironworks. They created one of the most advanced ironworks in the world, outproducing England, outproducing everywhere in the 1640s. And the idea of this pine tree shilling, this currency, was its value came from the fact that it was being used as credit to invest in the manufacturing capabilities of the colonies, the agricultural capabilities of the colonies, the infrastructure of the colonies, shipbuilding in the colonies, and of course the British went absolutely nuts at a certain point. And the whole thing was taken down with James II, Charles II, these guys that came in later, and the Glorious Revolution, with the creation of the Anglo-Dutch Empire in 1688. But this was the beginning of this, the seed taking hold in our precious country before there was an America. So now there were other people. There were people who were very, very influenced by this. Cotton Mather, who we will, we'll discuss later in depth. But Mather, who was the mentor of Benjamin Franklin, who wrote the Essays to Do Good. Benjamin Franklin, of course, who was one of the key founders of the United States, and who represented the principle of scientific progress, of the general welfare, of public works, public infrastructure, libraries, postal service, everything on behalf of the general welfare, fire departments, we'll talk about Ben Franklin more as well. But if you go to the next slide, I want to introduce to you a gentleman named George Washington. Now, people think they know who George Washington is, and you have no idea who this guy is. The average American has no idea who George Washington is, and that's a crime. And we, I really entreat you to find out about this person, because he created the nation from the beginning to the end. I mean, there were other people involved, but this guy was critical through the whole process. Now you see him there as a surveyor. And what is he doing? Well, he's surveying lands, working with Governor Spotswood of Virginia. And what's the idea? You have to get across the Appalachian Mountains. Go to the next slide there. Yeah, okay, so you can see there what the problem is. You have this range of mountains, the Appalachian Mountains. With Washington, with Spotswood, Governor Hunter, a whole bunch of people who were patriots in this beginning, even before we had a country, they understood you had to get on the other side of those mountains to develop the interior of the United States. So that's what Washington is focused on as a young man, as a surveyor, 16, 17 years old. Go back to the next, go back 2 slides. Next slide back. Okay, so there you see Colonel Washington. Now this is funny because what you had was the British Empire. We were subjects of the British Empire. To the west, you had the French. The British were not particularly interested in getting the French out of there because, kind of like the Mongol Empire or the Ottomans, they were blocking the development of the interior of the United States. So what does Washington do? He basically organizes the first shot of the French and Indian War in 1754, and then says to the British, "Okay, we're your colonists. You've got to come in and protect us from the French." So this whole war is organized by Washington. It's quite something, and it works. The French are driven out of there, but you go to the next slide. What the British do in the Treaty of Paris, I think it is 1763, what they do is they basically say, okay, now we're recreating the borders, and you see that map over there on the right-hand side. Say the colonies go this far and not any further. So that's what they've done. They've right at the point where we got a chance to break out, absolutely not, because it's the empire. It's the empire system. They know exactly what they're doing. So we have a revolution, and that revolution is it's the beginning of the creation of this republic and the potential to free all of mankind from the British Empire and potentially from the empire system as a whole. And this is in 1781. This painting is from the surrender of the British in Yorktown. Go to the next slide. So the effect of that revolution and the defeat of the British is seen in this map of 1784. All of a sudden, the United States of America expands all the way, or the colonies expand all the way to the Mississippi River. Right? We're not the United States yet. The Constitution isn't ratified yet, but the potential is there. So go on to the next. Now, this is right around this time, 1783. The official peace has not been signed yet, but Washington is up in Newburgh, and that's a statue of him at the Newburgh, his Newburgh headquarters, overlooking the Hudson River. That's right on the Hudson River in New York State. And what he does is he takes a tour. So he writes, "I have lately made a tour through the lakes George and Champlain as far as Crown Point, then returning to Schenectady. I proceeded up the Mohawk River to Fort Schuyler, formerly Fort Stanwix, crossed over to the Wood Creek, which empties into the Oneida Lake and affords the water communication with Ontario. Prompted by these actual observations, I could not help taking a more contemplative and extensive view of the vast inland navigation of these United States from maps and the information of others, and could not be struck with the immense diffusion and importance of it. Would to God we may have wisdom enough to improve them. I shall not rest contented till I have explored the Western country and traversed those lines, or great parts of them, which have given bounds to a new empire." So that's George Washington in 1783. We don't even have a constitution yet. He's already thinking about the internal development of the entire country. He's from Virginia. People would say he's a Virginia planter. Of course, he never hesitated to leave all that behind to fight the British and to secure this republic. And again, he does that. So, but he's a Virginian, but he's not thinking only about Virginia. He's thinking about a potential canal in New York State that could get us to the West. So I think that's very important, because he wasn't thinking about just his own state. It was the nation as a whole. And this is going to be critical, as everybody will see in the rest of this story. So there's a huge fight, and the states ratify the Constitution. And we will go into this in detail in another presentation, but it's a huge fight. This, just to give you a sense of this is during the fight for the ratification in Virginia, in the state of Virginia. And the gentleman on the left is Thomas Jefferson, who is definitely very much into the state of Virginia and his way of life in the state of Virginia. The gentleman on the right there is Patrick Henry, who everybody remembers from "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death." Well, he gives a speech at the Virginia ratifying convention, and he says, "Among 10,000 implied powers which Congress may assume, they may, if we be engaged in war, liberate every one of your slaves if they please. And this must and will be done by men, a majority of whom have not a common interest with you. Have they not the power to provide for the general defense and welfare? May they not think that these call for the abolition of slavery? May they not pronounce all slaves free? And will they not be warranted by that power?" Well, yes, they would be warranted by that power. And you see this idea of the general welfare, which is in the preamble of the Constitution that they're debating, already coming under attack by the slaveocracy. So go back one slide now. So the people who fought in the Revolution, like Washington, like Hamilton, they recognized that you had to have a strong central government. I mean, part of it was just during the Revolution itself, you couldn't demand that states provided troops. You couldn't demand that states provided money. You know, people like Robert Morris went through great pains to get the money together to win the revolution. And so this made a huge impression on Washington and his aide-de-camp, Hamilton. And when Hamilton became Treasury Secretary in the Washington administration, he created the first national bank and wrote a report on the question of public credit. The first report on public credit, the second report on public credit, which is about the national bank. This is an entirely unique idea created by people, and Washington is convinced, yes, we have to do this. And this is under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The Congress is given the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, also to collect taxes, for example. So this is a necessary means to do that. It's also a very good thing because it creates credit for the development of manufacturing, agriculture, and the internal improvements of infrastructure of the nation that are going to build the nation. And Hamilton's point is contrary to what Patrick Henry says, that there are men who have nothing in common with you that are going to take your slaves away and all. No, Hamilton says we're Americans. We have something in common because we're Americans. It doesn't matter if we're from Vermont. It doesn't matter if we're from Georgia. And there's not a conflict between agriculture and industry. There is a harmony of interest, as Matthew Carey and later Henry Carey discusses, his son. There's a harmony of interest between Americans and an economy. And the idea of having a stable currency that people can use to trade with amongst themselves, that they know that it's backed by the federal government. And that's what Hamilton does. And it's absolutely amazing. And we're going to really go into depth on that in the future. But this is a very unique American institution. And you'll see that this national bank it's what built the country, and it was basically there for the first 50 years of the nation with a few years in between. So Bob, you can go on with the next section.
Yeah, so one critical institution that Hamilton and Washington had discussed all throughout the war was the creation of a uniquely American military academy. And you can imagine the discussion and the dialogue, but between Hamilton and Washington on such matters. In 1796, in Washington's 8th annual address to Congress, he brings up the idea of, you can see the quote, the expediency of establishing a national university and a military academy. And he couples these things together because the idea is that these are nation. So the United States Military Academy is not going to be like any other military academy that's ever existed in the history of the world. You can go to the next slide. And Hamilton, in true Hamiltonian fashion, writes a great detailed curriculum for such an institution, which he sends to the Secretary of War, James McHenry, in 1799. Look at the curriculum. Look at what we're talking about. He calls it, the center of it is what he calls the fundamental school. And what's to be taught? Arithmetic, algebra, geometry, mechanics, geography, topography, surveying, designing structures and landscapes. And, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to learn some military tactics too. And then in the School of Engineers and Artillerists, fluxions, that's the calculus. That's Leibniz's calculus. Conic sections, hydraulics, fortifications, mining, chemistry, mineralogy, the fabrication of cannons, got to do that. It is a military academy. And principles of construction with particular reference to aqueducts, canals, and bridges. And they choose a fortification that was actually built with the assistance of French engineers up 50 miles north of New York City on a little peninsula that juts out into the Hudson called West Point. That was also the headquarters of Hamilton's artillery unit, among other things. Now, here's an interesting thing. So this is finally established in 1802 under President Adams, or actually under Adams pushed it, and it was not actually, it was under Jefferson when it was first set up. But who becomes the first superintendent of this military academy? Is it, you'd think, well, is it some great general from the Revolution, General Greene, General Gates, No. It's a person who basically has almost no military experience whatsoever and happens to be the great nephew of Benjamin Franklin. His name is Jonathan Williams. You see him on the left there. Williams was known more as a scientist. He did a whole series of experiments with Franklin. He spent a lot of time in Europe with Franklin during the Revolution. He also did was involved in an operation to procure arms for the American Revolution. But he's known more as a scholar and a scientist than as a soldier. What's the first thing he does when the military academy is established? He sets up something called the Military Philosophical Society. Now, for those familiar with Franklin, this has got Benjamin Franklin written all over it, right? Benjamin Franklin founded the American Philosophical Society. This is basically a salon where the top thinkers, nation builders of the country can gather and discuss the future of the country. And although the Military Philosophical Society does have an emphasis on military matters, they're really discussing nation building. Williams inherits the bulk of Franklin's library regarding technical books. So, and this becomes the West Point Library. So by the time that the academy is established, this is basically the largest repository of technical books in the United States. You can go to the next slide. So what happens is it somewhat languages under Jefferson, who's not very interested in nation building, as you can see from his opposition to Hamilton, the National Bank, and et cetera. But you have a patriotic kind of nationalist revival around the War of 1812. And this allows for an expansion of the academy to do what Hamilton and Washington wanted it to do. Both of them, of course, by now are deceased. Hamilton being murdered by Aaron Burr. So what happens is that two gentlemen, Sylvanus Thayer, who you see on the right, and another West Point engineering graduate, are sent to France by the then superintendent Joseph Gardner Swift. And they are tasked with gathering, they're given a budget, of whatever it was. And they're supposed to grab every book, every pamphlet, every document they can on anything dealing with technology, building of public works, infrastructure, et cetera. And because of what I mentioned before, of the circles around Leibniz, who ended up being centered in France, around the French Academy of Sciences and Colbert, et cetera, the École Polytechnique has that repository, basically, of all the most advanced scientific work to date of the European continent. So they bring back something like 90 crates of over 1,000 documents, books, et cetera. So you add that to the library that Williams had already put together from his great uncle, Benjamin Franklin, and you have by 1815, at West Point Military Academy Library, basically the greatest resources of scientific engineering and engineering literature in the Western world. So this is a real nation-building enterprise. That's what the whole agenda is. On the bottom there, you see James Monroe, who was the Secretary of War in this period, and he does something I consider to be completely ingenious, which is he says, listen, I mean, this is especially after the War of 1812. We're concerned about fortifications, naval, border. We have to protect the border, et cetera. So he says, well, roads, canals, all these things, internal communications, however they're designed, these things have military necessities. So he basically creates what later becomes known as the third system in the military, a board of fortifications which integrates all of the armed services to build. That's what they're doing. They're building these things under one complete system. And how is this able to happen? 1816, the National Bank, the second bank, is reestablished. And Chris, you can say something about that quickly. The next slide.
Yeah, the gentleman there is Nicholas Biddle, who is very, very important. In 1811, he warned about what would happen if the First National Bank was not rechartered. And it was not rechartered by the loss of one vote in the Senate and one vote in the House, because this states' rights mindset had already begun to really, really creep in. And then you had the War of 1812, and people realized we were in trouble. We did not have the means to actually fight the British, and our manufacturing capabilities, et cetera, have been taken down. Our credit system had been taken down. So it's generally agreed upon, yes, we need to restore the National Bank. And so in 1816, it's voted on, and the bank is restored. But Biddle, his whole idea is, again, this internal improvements, right? That the government has the right and the necessity to use the credit system to build roads, to build canals, later on railroads, and build the nation, as well as providing the credit for the average entrepreneur in manufacturing and agriculture. And the idea, I just want to make the point that this idea of the development of the nation, yes, it will end the slave system. It will. And the way it's going to do it is by bringing massive economic development to the country as a whole. It's going to bring economic development to the South, which is poor as hell. And because of the plantation system, particularly, it's poor. Everybody's poor, except for maybe a handful of rich plantation owners. But the average white person in the South is dirt poor as well. And the commitment to the general welfare, the commitment to industry and infrastructure is what's going to change all that. And so that's Biddle.
Okay, so the next slide. So they're not just going to sit around and read books or drill on the parade grounds. Right across, you see there on the right-hand side, probably if you can point the mouse, I don't know, you see West Point there, that little peninsula jutting out into the Hudson. And right across the river, there's a pond and a brook that runs down into the Hudson River. And so they come up with this ingenious idea that they're going to use that water flooding down into the Hudson to run a whole series of wheels, water wheels and mills, and establish what they call the West Point Foundry. This is done by Joseph Gardner Swift, who ceases being superintendent, works with the gentleman named Gouverneur Kemble. He's on the right there. And I'll just read you quickly their own description from the Kemble family of what this was. They say it's a pioneering manufacturing institution whose early history, name, and position are indelibly linked with West Point. This institution produced the first steam engine. This is some years later when this was written. Produced the first steam engine built in the country for practical use, furnished all the castings for the Erie Canal, the water pipes for the Croton Aqueduct, and for the cities of New York, Boston, and Chicago. From small beginnings, it became, in its time, one of the leading institutions for the manufacture of iron, brass, and so prided itself in its finished product. We can go to the next slide. And I happened to go to visit the site of this some weeks ago. And on the left there, you can see the whole complex, right? You have a machine shop, a molding shop, a casting shop. I mean, this is an all-in-one kind of Apollo program, crash program project to take the latest ideas of science and production and put it into practice and make things. Now, of course, they are making munitions. It's under the War Department. That's true. But as you can see from the description, they're making the castings for the Erie Canal. They're producing steam engines. They produce steam engines for the steamboats that went up and down the Hudson River. So this became a crucible, literally, of the early capability of the United States to produce its own manufacturing products at the highest level. On the bottom right there is the water wheel. On the top right is if you go there today, they have a little replica of a water wheel where it was. But that was a boring mill. And for those that are familiar with the Civil War, this is where the Parrott guns, the famous rifled cannon of the Civil War, were all produced at the West Point Foundry. You go to the next slide. So not only did they do that, but they also had a political operation to promote all of this. And in 1824, which is a very important year, which we'll see in a second, they set up a newspaper called the New York Patriot. Who's involved in this? Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, the former superintendent and West Point Foundry, creator, Swift, Joseph Gardner Swift. And look at what this represents. Very interesting, right? Why are they putting this paper out? They're going to create mass support to, quote, encourage the domestic manufacturers of our country, sustain our shipping interests, provide for a system of internal improvements by which, that's supposed to be a which, our internal trade may be extended and our reliance upon ourselves increased, and to harmonize agricultural, manufacturing, and commercial interests, showing that the whole may be advanced by a system of well-concerted measures. But not only that, besides political subjects, our press, our newspaper, the New York Patriot, will be devoted to a discriminating defense of American literature. As in politics and in arts, we would achieve our independence of other countries also in literature. Now, this will be a subject of a further presentation that we'll do as part of a series. There was a total cultural war going on, which Cooper, Irving, Edgar Poe, and others were involved in. But this is part of the West Point operation. Isn't that something, right? So again, this is not just a bunch of guys, running around learning about how to shoot guns or something. They do that, and quite proficiently, but it's a lot more. Next slide. So the big breakthrough comes in 1824. Monroe, who came up with that idea of the third system, he's now the president. And he ran through the Congress as part of this kind of patriotic revival, including the revival of the Second Bank, something called the General Survey Act. What does this do? This is extremely important, right? And I'll just read it. It's very short. The President of the United States is hereby authorized to cause the necessary surveys, plans, and estimates to be made of the routes of such roads and canals as he may deem of national importance in a commercial or military point of view, and is hereby authorized to employ 2 or more skillful civil engineers and such officers of the Corps of Engineers, that's the Army Corps of Engineers, who may be detailed to do duty with that corps as he may think proper. And what this does, you can go to the next slide, especially in the same year, 1824, John Quincy Adams, who is a fierce proponent of this whole project, becomes the president, is it unleashes an explosion. I mean, first of all, the West Point Academy becomes a factory for churning out the most skilled and competent engineers, really, I think, at that point on the planet. I mean, I may be wrong, but I think that's essentially truthful. They set up something called the Board of Engineers for Internal Improvements. And essentially, they have two of the French guys, or one of the French guys, Simon Bernard, who's involved in this. He comes out directly out of the École Polytechnique. And they are sent out along with an army, literally an army of engineers, across the country to survey these extraordinary projects, the Morris Canal, Chesapeake, Ohio Canal, and then later on railroads. The curriculum at West Point is adjusted so that the civil engineering and the science of war are put into a single course. Civil engineering, science of war, one idea. And they add into it designing of roads, tunneling, railroads, etc. You see that quote in 1828 by the Secretary of War Porter. Very truthful. The military academy is spreading the fruits, scattering the fruits of science, not merely to the army, but to the entire youth of our country generally. And the interchange of the theoretic science of this national school with the skill and judgment of our civilian engineers combined is now going on throughout the United States and will furnish every part of the country with the most accomplished professors in every branch of civil engineering. You can go to the next slide. So this just explodes the development of the country. This is a map from approximately the same period, probably around 1840. The red lines are roads. The blue, I guess is blue, are canals. And you can see the beginning of the railroads, the little black lines with the little dots on them. Those are railroads. I mean, look at that. This is all done in a span of a decade, really. It's a complete explosion. Board of Engineers and Internal Improvements carried out the surveying of 124 projects and began and were involved in the construction of 90 of them. These are not small things, right? This is huge, absolutely huge. By 1840, the United States had built 3,000 miles of railroads, 75% more than all the railroads in Europe combined, including in Great Britain. And you can see it's all going west. It's all going west. So completely unprecedented, not without opposition. And Chris can take it up from there.
Yeah, I mean, that's there's Andrew Jackson, there's the Yahoo opposition against this incredible development of the United States and the internal improvements. I mean, he's just a tool. He's not the brightest bulb in the world. He's the next slide, which we'll get to in a minute, shows the person who sort of shaped him and formed him. And it's Martin Van Buren. You'll see him in a minute. Actually, you can just go to Van Buren because, but I want to make a point that there's a gentleman named John Marshall who we'll look at in more detail soon in the near future. But Marshall was he basically created the idea of judicial review in the Supreme Court. And he was one of the key people. He fought in the American Revolution, very, very close friends with George Washington, was there organizing. But Marshall was there in Virginia countering Patrick Henry's foolishness on behalf of, he was fighting for the ratification. And he did a series of, led a series of decisions in the Supreme Court that again and again and again said the national bank is constitutional. Internal improvements, regulation of trade is a federal government policy. Internal improvements are the right of the nation to create. And so this has all been decided by the Supreme Court, by the people that created the country. And then this creep is brought in, knocking out John Quincy Adams in 1828, Andrew Jackson, and he's a creation of Martin Van Buren, who came directly out of the Burr circles. Burr basically used Van Buren because Burr had been tried for treason. Burr had been caught trying to split the country in half and rip the Mississippi River Valley away from the United States while he was vice president of the United States under Thomas Jefferson. So Burr realizes his political future is not very bright at that point. So, Martin Van Buren comes in, and what Van Buren does is he represents a marriage of Wall Street and the Southern slave interests. And what they do now, consider this, what Bob went through that map from a couple slides back of all that development inside there, right? That was all set into motion under Monroe and John Quincy Adams. So by 1828, most of that is set into motion. It's kind of like the Apollo project under John F. Kennedy. He didn't live to see it, but he had set it into motion, and it came to fruition. So you had this Apollo project of this development, but these guys come in and just move to destroy every single aspect of this, one after the next. You have the Maysfield Road veto in 1830, where Jackson basically says the federal government doesn't have the power to build a road. He moves immediately to destroy the Second National Bank. And then later, Van Buren literally overturns the 1824 General Survey Act. So these guys say, no, the Army Corps of Engineers cannot have any power to scope out the internal improvements of the nation. Absolutely not. So what they do, and if you go to the next slide, what you can see on the screen there is the British Empire system. Like we said, this is what we're up against. It didn't go away just because we won the American Revolution and created the Republic. The empire is still there. And what these guys did, look at the chart, the little chart there underneath the map, and look at the percentage of cotton becoming the growing percentage of that as a part of the economy in the United States. And that's the British Empire system taking over the United States and saying, no internal improvements. We want slaves and cotton for our textile mills. So you have the arrow going from the textile mills. You have, capital flowing in through Wall Street, cotton going out to the textile mills, cheap cotton then being dumped on India, that being paid for with opium, and then the opium being used to subjugate our friends in China and run a drug war against the minds of the Chinese people. That's what the British Empire was doing. That's what the United States was founded to defeat. And slavery was well on its way to being wiped out until these creeps took over. That great so-called patriot, Jackson, the darling of the Democratic Party. They still have Jackson dinners, right? This creep with Martin Van Buren, they destroyed that and set the country back and basically set up the conditions for the Civil War, which, if you go to the next slide, thank God Abraham Lincoln came in as president and we saved the Republic again. We saved the Union. It was under attack, sure, by the slaveocracy, but the point about that last slide and the point about all this, the British are trying to break the United States apart. The empire system is trying to break the United States apart. And what Lincoln does is absolute genius in militarily. I mean, he organizes the victory of the Civil War. But while that Civil War is going on, he does something else. Lincoln has long been a champion of internal improvements in the national bank, starting in the 1830s. he is with that. And what you see in the next slide, what Bob will take up, is that in the middle of the war, Lincoln is totally preoccupied with building railroads.
Yeah, and what you see there is your army at work. So that's on the right is Grenville Dodge, who is Ulysses S. Grant's intelligence operative in the Western theater of the War of the Rebellion. But he also goes on to play the huge role in the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Of course, there ends up to being the Great Northern Railroad. All these are combative, but this is the dream, right? We're now breaching the Rocky Mountains. We're at the Pacific. You can go to the next slide. And this is a very common idea. This is a quote on the bottom there by Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, who then, of course, was a U.S. Senator, was a U.S. Senator before that and after. And here's what he says. And he gave many speeches like this. This is just one of them. He says, "Who does not see that every year European commerce, European politics, European thoughts, European activity, although gaining greater force in European connections, although actually becoming more intimate, will nevertheless ultimately sink in importance, while the Pacific Ocean, its shores, its islands, the vast regions beyond, will become the chief theater of events in the world's great hereafter." So this is how they're thinking. And in a future presentation, we'll go through. This is very concrete with operations by the Lincoln people, Burlingame and Company into China and all of Asia. You can go to the next slide. This is a map that was actually produced post-Civil War. And there was a famous, it's not famous, we made it famous, but there was a dinner in 1869, or a celebration, I guess it was a dinner, to send off Andrew Curtin, who was from Pennsylvania, to become the new ambassador to Russia. There it's Henry Carey, Lincoln's economist, was there, and this gentleman, Civil War hero, really, General Joshua Owen, and he gives a toast to the outgoing Curtin, Ambassador Curtin, on his way, and the Russian ambassador is there too, also. Now remember, you had this, kind of dialogue between Lincoln and Tsar Alexander II. The Russians played a huge role, a big, very important role in supporting the Union in the War of the Rebellion. So Joshua Owen says, the Pacific Railroad spans the continent. So this is the Transcontinental Railroad. And the locomotive breaks the silence of ages, which has brooded over the Rocky Mountain regions. We stand on the shores of the Pacific and cast wistful eyes over its expansive waters to see if any kindred people will join us in girdling the globe with a tramway of iron, over which shall pass the commerce of the world. 1869. So you can see this is the idea of a world land bridge girdling the globe with the tramway of iron, including all the interior regions of both Africa, as you can see on the map, South America, and the Eurasian heartland. Wow, this sent the British into apoplectic fits. Go to the next slide. And this wasn't just a map and good thoughts. I mean, these were very concrete things. Even before the Civil War was finished, West Point was off in Russia. This is George Washington Whistler, one of the greatest of these Army engineers, who worked directly with Alexander II and built the first modern major railroad in Russia from St. Petersburg to Moscow in the 1850s. At West Point, engineers ended up going into Egypt, Central and South America, et cetera, carrying out this kind of nation building with in-depth economic development and the development of infrastructure and these kind of development corridors. So, Chris?
So here's our proposal, that the United States return to its mission and work with Russia, work with China, the great engineers of these three nations, working together to build this land bridge of economic development and fulfill the mission of the United States against the empire system. And that's what we have to do now. That's what we have to organize now, and bring the principles of our nation back. We are far from that. We are on the brink of war instead, exactly where the British Empire would want us to be. But if we return to American principles, there's a very, very bright future. And we at the LaRouche Organization really want people to study this history, to know our history, and so that they can't be fooled by the manipulations that are going on right now. But so we're going to do a series of videos. This is the beginning. We hope you enjoy it, and we will be in touch in the very near future.